With both the Doom Eternal DLC campaigns out of the way, the next major id Software project is still up in the air. They could always just do another Doom game, sure, but after playing both of the Ancient Gods campaigns, I get the feeling they're done with the brand for the time being. So, what's next then? The name you most often hear thrown around for a revival from boomer shooter fanboys such as myself is a true blue reboot of Quake. Specifically the first Quake game, none of that Strogg or multiplayer only stuff that came to dominate the brand afterward. With the only real game of note carrying the Quake name being the multiplayer only Quake Champions, a real attempt at reviving the series in the vein of Doom 2016 would be pretty neat. So, for the sake of this purely theoretical video, if a reboot of Quake were to happen, how could it be done? Let's set up my ground rules for this thought exercise. As I said in the opening, I think the first Quake game should be the basis for a proper revival. It's the most unique of the Quake games, even today, with an interesting aesthetic style, as well as being the ripest for nostalgia milking. Naturally, the perfect source for the creatively bankrupt game industry. Second ground rule, I'm only talking about the single player campaign for this. How to successfully revive Quake's multiplayer is a pretty big subject on its own, and I have some odd ideas on how exactly you could do it, and I'm pretty sure expressing that would get me tarred and feathered by the hardcore fanbase, so we'll just leave this subject untouched. So what exactly makes Quake feel like Quake? Before talking about how I think it should be brought back, we should first get across, in my opinion, how Quake makes itself unique. After all, there's no doubt that Quake is at its core a Doom shooter. Both games have essentially the exact same gameplay structure and loop, this much is a given. Quake still managed to forge a unique identity compared to Doom. Why is that? Here, the devil is in the details. One major difference I'd say comparing Doom and Quake is that the latter has far fewer enemies in a level and on screen at a given time when compared to the more hectic levels of the former. Despite the lower enemy count, Quake makes up for that by making each individual enemy stronger and tougher than any of the Doom rogues gallery. Just in comparison, Quake's enemies are much more imposing on their own, with varied projectile, hit scan, or melee attacks, and increased aggression and speed compared to other similar shooters at the time. In terms of level design, one thing Quake really pushed over the comparatively flat Doom level layouts was a complete use of true 3D space. The levels are multi-floored, multi-layered labyrinths that more often than not promote secret hunting and alternate progression due to Quake's increased focus on movement tricks. While the inclusion of a jump is itself a massive game changer when compared to Doom, the Quake style of movement which id Software would keep in their games up until Rage has a bouncier, rubbery feel to it which is hard to describe but something you can just instantly register when you play it. While things such as rocket jumping and bunny hopping were apparently unintentional quirks of the game, the full use of 3D aiming and most of the player's weaponry being projectile based were more than likely intentional ways to show off Quake's embrace of full 3D. That's just the fine details of the gameplay too. The set dressing with the setup, aesthetics, and more is where Quake really shines. The initial call to action is similar to Doom, military teleporting experiment results in monster invasion, go kick ass. It even starts off with the same sci-fi base setting, but very quickly Quake builds its own vibe. Unlike the stark use of bright reds that make up most of Doom, Quake is more consistently dark, grimy, and dour, and replaces the Doom setting of sci-fi labs and hell with castles by way of brutalist architecture filled with knights and fantasy monsters like ogres. And even after that, Quake's later levels embrace full Call of Cthulhu style City of Relay style non-Euclidean geometry, just to lean into the game's H.P. Lovecraft inspirations. The labyrinths stop resembling anything at all and become full-on abstract mazes. This is where the low poly models actually work in the game's favor, with the lack of detail adding to the atmosphere of being in some completely alien abstract place with no rhyme or reason. You could argue that Wolfenstein 3D and Doom 1 and 2 also did the whole low poly abstract levels thing, but the difference I'd argue is that they both still try to present a facsimile of locations you can imagine. A prison, laboratory, metal album cover hell, and so on. Quake, in contrast, gives no such context for these later levels. On top of that, Quake has no real transition between any of these three very distinct styles, which adds to the feel of the world just being erratic and broken. However, in my opinion, the real cornerstone of Quake's atmosphere is the soundtrack by Trent Reznor. We need a bit of background context for this, for the uninitiated. The 1990s was the era of the edgelord, where angst was king, grunge lived and died, goth went mainstream, and the satanic panic was still in full swing. During this period, Trent Reznor was the spearhead and creator of one of, if not the absolute, biggest industrial music acts of the era, Nine Inch Nails. Fresh off the mainstream success of the Woodstock 1994 set and the high sales of his second album, The Downward Spiral, one of my all-time favorites by the by, seriously I could talk about Downward Spiral for literal hours, it's hard to get across how big Reznor was around this period and how odd it was for him to become fully involved in a video game. Reznor was directly involved in the production of Quake's audio design from day one, and from all accounts was 100% committed to putting all his effort into the project. He not only composed all the music, but did every aspect of the sound design and even the grunts of the player character Ranger too. Getting to his soundtrack work itself, this is the most stark contrast between Doom and Quake. Gone are the thrash metal and hard rock inspired tracks that made up the Doom games, because outside of the rockin' but still significantly darker title screen music, Quake's soundtrack just bleeds pure atmosphere. It's slow, moody industrial that, when paired with the aesthetic choices discussed earlier, gives Quake this borderline action horror feel that no other game really tries to emulate. So that just begs the question, how do you redo it? First off, these are all very rough ideas at best. I'm no game developer, I'm just a fucking idiot who wanted to play Quake again and needed some half-assed excuse to do so.
Excellent!
It's also worth touching on an opinion regarding rebooting the first Quake that I've seen expressed in the past. The gist of it is that Quake, for the reasons we went over and a few more from its behind-the-scenes story too lengthy to get into today, is a game that is a complete product of its time and can't effectively be brought back without feeling inauthentic. Quake is the 1990s embodied, and a reboot just risks wearing the same getup in an effort to just pander to the fanbase looking for a similar experience. It sort of feels like what I would imagine are the kind of issues that a modern day remake of The Crow would run into, just for an example. In that case, it might just be better to leave Quake 1's style back in its time to look back on and appreciate instead. And yes, this does negate the entire stated point of the video, but since all my videos are exercises in futility anyway, we may as well just keep going and see where that leads us. The big goal for a modern day Quake reboot would be to differentiate itself from the new Doom games. The big way I'd suggest doing it is to play up all the retro shooter tropes which Doom lost in the transition to the 2016 reboot. Do away with every combat encounter taking place in closed off arenas, glory kills, perks, all that modern jazz. Instead, go back to the old id Software game structure of key hunting, maze-like levels, and the goal being to get from point A to point B, with the combat and secrets being something the player can choose to go after or avoid in the best scenarios. However, to really highlight the leaps and bounds in technology, and to make it feel like a true successor rather than just retread, use modern tricks to create absolutely gargantuan levels. Anyone who's played the Quake mod Arcane Dimensions knows what I'm talking about, but imagine the labyrinthine level design of something like a Doom or a Quake, but dialed up to 11 with a massive size that can take anywhere from an hour to complete. Like the original, I think a new Quake should also not have a great amount of enemies on screen at a given time, instead making the individual enemies themselves more imposing on their own. What I would also do is design said enemies to not only be strong and durable, but have a somewhat expansive moveset the player has to work around and deal with. This may sound odd for anyone who's spoken about Doom Eternal with me in private, but I think id showed some real potential for these kind of enemies I'm spitballing here with the Marauder. While I wasn't completely crazy about his implementation in the game itself, the idea is extremely sound. A single enemy with a variety of different melee swings, a rapid dodge and shield to prevent pure offensive threat, and 2 ranged attacks, with the big weakness being a parry window. It's a great idea, and I think this sort of enemy design philosophy of more threatening individual enemies would work well for a Quake reboot. Unlike the extremely lore-heavy new Doom games, I'd say keep whatever story is in this theoretical Quake launch to a minimum. For a cosmic horror background, having little knowledge about the motivation or exact plan for the main old god villain helps with that whole fear of the unknown shtick. Movement tricks like bunny hopping, rocket jumping, and maybe even strafe jumping should all be brought back and put in with intention. Few other AAA action games bother with movement tricks like this, let alone first-person AAA action games, which would help set a Quake reboot apart from the crowd. Streamlining the execution for how to pull these off, like how Quake Champions attempted to, might be a decent idea as well, just to give a larger audience a chance to play around with it. One issue I have is trying to decide how to handle the sound. Reznor was a key aspect of Quake's identity, and I can't think of a suitable replacement. It's entirely possible that id goes to get Andrew Husholt to do this, and in his defense, his work on Dusk actually could be fairly dark and atmospheric like you would want in a Quake game. To be honest though, if Bethesda or now Microsoft is willing to pay, I think it might actually be interesting if they tried to get Trent Reznor himself back for the project. After all, the man's made a hell of a name for himself as a film composer since the release of Quake, even netting an Oscar along the way for his work. And considering he still has interest in keeping Nine Inch Nails going, as shown with his latest trilogy of EPs, this potentially could be a perfect storm scenario for him to come back and take another swing at Quake. And really, that about sums it up. Again, this is an extremely bare-bones attempt at a reboot thought exercise. But regardless, thanks for watching, and let's wait and see how wrong I end up being whenever they actually do try to revive Quake. You know, assuming they ever actually do.